Hello, Year 12. Welcome to the online version of the first lesson of the year. We're starting the course with Development in Christian Thought, which is our first unit. As you should already know, it's divided into three sections. So we've got Development in Christian Thoughts, then we've got the Philosophy of Religion, and then we've got Religion and Ethics. So our first week, we're going to be looking at the afterlife. This is something that you will know a little bit about from the GCSE, and we're essentially looking at different Christian understandings of life after death. So, along with this online lesson, you should be referring to your um, resources as well. So there's lots of information in both the OCR textbook and in the textbook which the RS department has written for you. So you can have those open and be referring to those as a source of notes as well. Okay, so the afterlife in Christianity. Let's get started. So what does Christianity actually teach about the afterlife? And like all things in Christianity, this can be a little bit confusing because there are so many different sources. The most important thing to realize is that Jesus, according to the gospel, died on the cross and then was resurrected. Because of this, Christians believe that there will be an afterlife. Jesus' death on the cross is an atoning sacrifice, which means that we also can rise from the dead and have an eternal life with God. The question becomes, what exactly does this eternal life look like? Is it on earth? Is it in heaven? When will it be? Will it happen straight away? Will it happen at the end of time? And I guess importantly, what will it look like and how will you get there? What will you be judged based on? So lots and lots of questions. And this goes all the way back to the first part of the Bible, which is the Old Testament. So the book of Daniel talks about an afterlife. And here's an interesting quote. So these are quotes that you can use in all essays. So, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. So, contempt is sort of negative, it's damnation. So, here we seem to have the idea that people will die, be buried, and they'll wake up. So this seems to be a judgment at the end of time, and it seems to be that the destination is divided into two places, a place of everlasting life and a place of everlasting contempt. We might like to see this as heaven, hell. So the dead will be resurrected. Resurrected means to come back, to be brought back. And the question becomes, is this a physical resurrection or a spiritual one? The difference between this is, do our bodies come back? Well, many Christians might say yes, because Jesus had a physical resurrection. His body came back from the grave. But what about people who've been, died in a fire, or people who have rotted away? The body decomposes. So are we to believe that God brings us back by miraculously reforming a dead body? Or perhaps it's a spiritual resurrection. Spirit means the non-physical part of our nature, our soul. So maybe the body dies and the soul comes back. So this is quite confusing, and there are lots and lots of different Christian beliefs. This quote also seems to suggest that everyone will be resurrected together. Multitudes means many people. So many people who sleep in the dust will awake, and that seems to be together. Now, what that would suggest then is that nobody is in heaven or hell yet. Because everybody will be resurrected together. And obviously, lots of people haven't died yet. So this suggests that there's a day of reckoning, a day of judgment, a day of resurrection, and this happens at the end of time. So nobody is in heaven or hell yet. Obviously, it suggests that some people will go to heaven and others will go to hell. We've got questions about what heaven and hell actually are and where they are, but we can look at that later. And we've also got to ask, what's this based on? Is it based on faith in Jesus Christ? Is it based on good and bad behavior? And we have different accounts of this throughout the Christian tradition as well. Okay, so there's also a question of personal identity. In what way will you be the same person after you've died? In what sense can this still be you? And there's lots of philosophical problems that surround this. So if you die as an old person, are you going to come back as an old person? If you die as a young person, you're going to come back as a young person. If you're dying and you're a young child, a baby, do you come back as a young baby? What exactly comes back? So there's lots of confusing questions surrounding this. And like all things in Christianity, we can refer to the main Christian teachers. So St. Paul is incredibly important when it comes to Christianity. So St. Paul was a apostle, so somebody who followed Jesus Christ. He didn't actually know Jesus. Paul had a famous conversion experience because he originally started out as a Pharisee, a Jewish teacher who disliked Christians and was trying to kill Christians. Eventually, he had a conversion experience on the road to Damascus. You're going to learn more about this in the course. And he becomes a fervent Christian. So he becomes somebody who is incredibly fanatical about the Christian faith. And he writes a lot of the New Testament. So we know the New Testament is about the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. And the first four books are the Gospel, the Good News, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then we have the Acts of the Apostles. So we have stories about the early church, and we also have Paul's letters. So Paul writes loads and loads of letters. You'll have learned about this in your GCSE, Corinthians, Thessalonians, all of these letters. And this is one of his famous sections of one of his letters. So he's writing to the church in Corinth, which is in Greece. And he says this: the body that is sown is perishable. What that means is the body as we see it today is perishable. It will rot away. Sown means the body that is planted, the body that's on this earth. So this is the idea that body will decompose. However, it's raised imperishable. After resurrection, it comes back in a form which won't rot away. It's sown in dishonor and raised in glory. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. So this seems to suggest that there won't be a physical resurrection. Jesus Christ had a physical resurrection, as we remember, Easter Sunday, but it seems that we won't have this form of resurrection. Instead, it will be some sort of soul or essence or substance, something that is not physical that's going to come back. Okay, so the physical body will decay and it will not survive life after death. Before death, you're sinful, but you'll be resurrected and glorified. So there'll be a perfect version of your body. And this is quite clearly a spiritual resurrection. Okay, so we've got lots of Christian sources of authority that tell us lots of different things. And this makes for quite an interesting essay because you can compare and contrast the different ways that a Christian can discuss the afterlife. Okay, Here is another quote from Paul. Again, this is Corinthians. For we know that the earthly tent is destroyed. We have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed in our heavenly dwelling, for when we are clothed, we will not be naked. So, using lots of metaphors here, metaphor of clothing, tents, he seems to be saying is that tents is something that covers us and protects us, but it's only temporary. So this seems to be that our body, our earthly tent, is destroyed. So this is the same sort of point, isn't it? Life after death is eternal and permanent. We have a tent on earth, but we have a house, a building in heaven. On earth we are naked and ashamed because we're sinful. This reminds us of Genesis and Adam and Eve and the nudity of humans after the first sin. Whereas in heaven, our shame is removed. Okay, so central beliefs for Christians. So Christians believe they will be resurrected. That's essential. You can't really be a Christian unless you believe that. This is a part of the Apostles' Creeds. This is also a part of the Nicene Creed. We'll be looking at these more across the course. A creed is a set of fundamental beliefs. The resurrected person will be the same person as the one who's died, because obviously you're going to be judged based on your actions that you performed as the same person in your earthly life. And life after death will be a miracle given by God. So this is the only one of Jesus's miracles that you can actually participate in. Jesus rose from the dead, and because of this, he eradicated sin from the world, and you also can rise from the dead. It's a gift of God's grace. Grace is God's love freely given to sinners. Okay, so what actually happens? Well, there's no clear answer. We don't really know. It's all to do with faith, and even then, there are different things that different Christians refer to. So we do know, of course, that we die, and there's supposed to be some sort of resurrection. Does that happen straight away? Well, it can't happen straight away physically, can it? Because the body is still in the ground. All people who have died have a body that has been buried or burnt. So maybe it happens at the end of time, but that's only if you believe in a physical resurrection. It could be that the soul is resurrected straight away. Jesus obviously rose from the dead 3 days later, but this doesn't seem to happen in a physical form anyway to people who die today. So either immediately after death or altogether in the future. So an interesting question might be, is anyone in heaven right now? Just think about that for a second. All the good people who've died, are they in heaven yet? Well, maybe not. Maybe no one's in heaven, and all people who've died and are yet to die need to wait for a communal resurrection at the end of time. Or maybe, God forbids, I die today. Maybe my soul is in heaven tomorrow, and there are people in heaven. It's just that my soul has left my body. So there's lots of disagreement. So you will be judged. Again, will it be your soul that's judged, or will it be your body that's judged? This is debatable. And will it be immediately, or will it be all together at the end of time? And what will you be judged based on? Can you go to heaven if you're a bad person, but you believe in Jesus? Or maybe all good people go to heaven, and it doesn't matter if you believe in Jesus. Or maybe you need both. So this is an interesting question in Christianity. Will the good atheist go to heaven? Will the bad, evil Christian go to heaven? You could argue that you won't go to heaven if you're a bad Christian, because you're not really a Christian. To be a Christian, you have to follow Jesus' teachings. So it gets very complicated. And then also we have this idea of purgatory for Roman Catholics. So Catholics are those people who follow the Pope in Rome. Purgatory, we're going to look at in a second. This is sort of a middle ground for people who are not quite good enough for heaven, but not quite bad enough for hell. Okay, and then we have heaven and hell as a final destination. And there's another question here, which is, once you're in heaven, once you're in hell, is there any way out? Is it eternal? You might say, yeah, well, of course it is. However, is a loving God going to keep people punished in hell forever? So we have another question here as well, which gets quite complicated. And is heaven or hell eternal? Is it a spiritual place? Is it a physical place? If it's a physical place, then where is it? If it's a spiritual place, then where is it? This gets quite confusing. Okay, so some questions arise when we think about going somewhere new after death. And these are the questions. We've looked at this already. Where exactly is it? Traditionally, people thought of hell as a burning lake of fire. That's a quote from the Bible. And that may be because underneath the earth is volcanic, hot lava. We know that geologically. So perhaps when people saw volcanoes, they assumed, well, that's an entrance to hell. And what do we think of as heaven? Well, we think of it as a light place in the sky with clouds, and what's that? Well, that's what's above us. So are these actually what heaven and hell are like? We know that heaven isn't in the sky because astronauts and pilots have been to the sky. We don't see heaven there. So what actually is it, and where is it? Is it a physical place? Will you be the same person? In what way will you be the same person? Will you be the person that you were when you died? There's an issue of personal continuity here as well. And also, is it within time? How long does it last? Well, you might say forever, but then does time even exist in heaven and in hell? It's outside of this world. It's outside of this universe, presumably, and this universe is governed by time. So this becomes quite confusing as well. Okay, so let's look at one of our Christian thinkers. So this is somebody who's going to be turning up constantly throughout the course. This is a very famous philosopher, a Christian, called Thomas Aquinas. So St. Paul was writing really only just after Jesus was teaching. Aquinas is writing around 1,000 years after Jesus. So he's more of a medieval philosopher. And Aquinas was very interested in these ideas. So Thomas Aquinas, heavily influenced by Christianity, in particular the Catholic Church. Aquinas' views about life after death were mixed. He had lots of different views. He admired Aristotle and he admired Plato. I'm going to be coming on to the philosophy of Aristotle and of Plato later on in the course. Just as a quick introduction now, they were both ancient Greek philosophers who were writing before Christianity. So they weren't Christian. However, lots of their thoughts inspired Christians. So lots of Christians, including Aquinas, read Plato and Aristotle and tried to incorporate their thinking into Christian teachings. So he admired Aristotle's philosophy and Plato's. Plato believed that the soul could survive death. So obviously this is quite a Christian idea, or Aquinas is going to think so. And Aquinas believed in something called the beatific vision. This means after death, you will come face to face with God. Beatific, it's beautiful. Vision, you're seeing God. And this is something that's not even describable. It's outside of time. It's something that is so amazing that you can't quite even understand it. Okay, so the beatific vision is outside of space and time. So there's a criticism that's quite interesting, which says, if heaven and hell last forever, would you get bored? Would you get bored of an everlasting paradise? And you might have worked this out already. Aquinas' response is going to be, well, no, you won't get bored because there's no time. You can only get bored in time. You spend too long doing something, you get bored. But seeing God is outside of time. So how long does heaven last for Aquinas? I guess his answer would be an infinite amount of time and also no time. If you can't understand that or you're struggling, don't worry. That's because you live in time. Okay? So we have Platonic Plato and Aristotelian Aristotle ideas on the soul, which influenced philosophers such as Aquinas. So just to remind you again, Plato and Aristotle, we've got pictures here, Plato on the left, Aristotle on the right. They were ancient Greek, they were not Christian. However, they did influence Christianity quite heavily. So Plato believed that we have an eternal soul that will survive death and live forever. And obviously, this inspires Christians because Christians believe something similar. Aristotle says that our soul is our life force. It gives us purpose, but it won't survive after death because it cannot be separated from the body. We're going to give some examples of this in a second. So many Christians have relied more on Plato's understanding of the soul than on Aristotle's understanding, because Aristotle seems to suggest that you can't survive death. And here are some examples. So, telos is a Greek word which means goal or purpose. And this is a word that Aristotle is very interested in. So to try and understand how the soul can't survive death, Aristotle uses a few different examples. One example is an axe, another example is the eye. So let's look at the axe. For Aristotle, the soul is simply what allows something to complete its purpose. Okay? So the soul of an axe is its ability to chop. If it loses its ability to chop, then it's lost its soul. So let's imagine it's been snapped. Its soul is gone. That doesn't mean that something is vanished from it. It doesn't mean that it has some floaty, ghost-like substance. All it means is it's stopped working. So this axe has lost its soul. It doesn't have it because it can't chop anymore, unable to fulfill its purpose. Here's another example. What is the soul of an eye? Well, we've got to ask, what's the purpose of the eye? And the purpose of the eye is to see. Let's imagine you go blind. You've lost the purpose of your eye. So your eye has lost its soul. This doesn't mean, again, that there's some ghostly substance that has arisen and disappeared. It just means you can't work anymore. And Aristotle then says, well, what's the soul of a human? Well, it's the ability to be able to achieve flourishing. This is a word that he calls eudaimonia in Greek. And this just means the ability to live a good life. If you die, you've lost this ability. It's gone. That doesn't mean that your soul has floated off somewhere. Your soul just is your ability to physically function. So let's be really clear about this. A human being is a combination of two dimensions, matter and form. Matter, the physical atoms in your body, and form is the ability for those atoms to function and fulfill their telos, their goal. So you might find this quite complex. We're going to be looking at Aristotle in more detail later on in the course. The most important thing to realize is that Aristotle thinks that you don't survive death. If you lose your soul, that just means your body has stopped working. Okay? Now, Aquinas says something similar, but obviously he's inspired by Plato as well. So, the soul is a life principle. It's the form or distinctive character of living things. So your soul is your ability to be able to walk, breathe, live, talk, do all of the things that you can do in life. The soul of a human being is different to the soul of other things, the soul of an animal or the soul of a vegetable. The animal soul dies when the body dies. Okay, so that's very similar to Aristotle. But Aquinas says the human soul is rational, it can use reason, and it survives death. So this is where he's very different to Aristotle. Okay, the human soul survives death. And this is much more similar to Plato. So Aquinas seems to be inspired by both Plato and and Aristotle. Okay, so Aquinas says our ability to philosophize of intelligence, use logic and reason is not a physical ability. And so when our body dies, there's something else to us. And that's what goes to heaven, to the beatific vision, to see God. So our ability to use reason or logically argue is unique to human beings. It's contained in our soul rather than in our physical matter. And you might disagree with this. You might think, well, our ability to think is actually because of the electrical signals firing in our brain. But Aquinas didn't think this. Aquinas thought we have a rational soul, something non-physical. So for Aquinas, the soul is what gives us our ability to accomplish what we're made to do. We're made to use reason and to make free choices to love God, to achieve the final goal of living eternally in the presence of God, life after death, the beatific vision. Okay? So our telos, again, telos, a Greek word which means purpose. Our purpose is to see the vision of God in heaven and to fulfill the image that God created us in. So God created us in his image, in the image of God. It's called the imago Dei. This is Latin. Dei means God. Imago means the image. So God has made us in his image, and we need to freely choose through reason to fulfill this. And that's our purpose, and that's what our soul is striving to achieve. Okay, so in the afterlife, we achieve this beatific vision, state of perfect bliss in the presence of God. In normal life, we have faith, but in heaven, we have knowledge. We don't know that God exists in this world, but in heaven, we know that he exists. We can see him face to face, the beatific vision. Okay, so you could argue that this is reflected in Paul's writings. So Paul was writing 1,000 years before Aquinas, and his writings were contained, as we've said already, in the New Testament. So this is another of the quotes from his letter to the Corinthians. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So this is very similar to the beatific vision, isn't it? We can't see God fully in this world. However, in the next world, we come face to face with God. Okay. So the beatific vision for Aquinas is timeless. How long does it last for? Well, it doesn't last for any time. It's one moment that's extended forever. It's eternal. Faith no longer exists because the believer is in the presence of God. Life on earth is linear, which means it has a beginning, middle, and an end, past, present, and future. Life in heaven for Aquinas is one moment. There's no future, there's no passage of time, there's no past. It's just one beautiful, ecstatic, wonderful moment in the presence of God. Okay, so let's do a very quick recap. Christians believe that they will be resurrected after death because of the belief that Jesus was resurrected after he was crucified. After his burial, Jesus' tomb was empty and he appeared to his followers. This means that most Christians believe that resurrection will be physical because Jesus resurrected in a physical form on earth. It is unclear exactly how resurrection will occur, but there are three main beliefs in Christianity about the nature of resurrection. The first is that resurrection will be bodily, and the body that is raised will be glorified and spiritual, which means that it cannot be corrupted, so it cannot rot. Christians also believe that the identity of the resurrected person will be the same. Finally, Christians do not believe that resurrection is a natural process. Instead, it's considered to be a miracle and a gift of God's grace. Aquinas' views of life after death were heavily influenced by Plato and Aristotle. He developed Aristotelian thinking that the soul is the life principle of a human, the force that enables us to fulfill our purpose or telos. For Aquinas, the purpose of the person is to use reason and freely choose to love God. However, he also believed that the soul could survive death, which is a more Platonic view. He believed that the soul was capable of the beatific vision, which refers to the soul coming face to face with God. Okay, excellent. So let's keep moving. So let's think about heaven and hell then as actual destinations. Nobody knows what heaven and hell looks like. Nobody even knows if heaven and hell exists. They are articles of faith, which means Christians have faith. They trust that they are real places, but they don't know. So artistic depictions are always going to be guesses. So this is the Last Judgment by an artist called Michelangelo, and this is in the Sistine Chapel, which is in Rome. So it's a Catholic image, and what we have right in the top middle of the picture is Jesus Christ, and here he's raising everybody from the dead. So everyone's naked. Their bodies are back. We don't know if they're physical bodies, spiritual bodies. We don't know if they're the same body. But what we can see is angels lifting people towards heaven. If you look at the bottom of the picture, we have demons lifting people or dragging people towards hell. Here's another image. It's called the Ladder of Divine Ascent. So here we have people ascending towards heaven, and then we have demons who are dragging people because they haven't made it, and they're dragging them towards damnation. Here we have another image by an artist called Jan van Eyck, and this is the crucifixion and the last judgments. So on the left panel, we have Jesus Christ's crucifixion on the cross, and for Christians, this ensured that all people could now reach salvation and escape death. On the right panel, we have in the top half Jesus Christ as the divine judger of the good and the bad. So we have the angels and people being dragged up to heaven, and again at the bottom, those who didn't make it in the realm of hell and damnation. So this is a tricky question in Christianity. What is heaven actually like? Well, I guess it's not like anything, because we cannot understand it, because all of our frames of reference are based on life on this earth. So we can just guess. I think that's the best Christian response, really. It's just guesswork. Obviously, you have lots of artistic depictions, a place of light in the sky. Here are some tricky questions. So, would an eternity in heaven even be desirable? Well, we could argue it would get boring. But then obviously Aquinas would disagree and say that beatific vision isn't in time. So You can only get bored if there is a time frame in which to get bored. And we have other philosophers now. So this is a philosopher called Bernard Williams, and he seems to be disagreeing with Aquinas, and he says eternity in heaven wouldn't be desirable. There's an entire world that we could make the most of, but being in heaven for eternity simply to worship God, the novelty, which means the thrill of it, the enjoyment of something new, would get old. Do you agree with this criticism? That's something for you to bring in essays. So what is hell like? Well, we've got lots of imagery in the Bible, a burning lake of fire you'll remember from your GCSE. Is it actually a lake of fire, or is that just a way that Christians have tried to describe it to scare people? Here are some questions. So we could ask, well, what's the big problem? Well, there's an omnibenevolence problem. Why would an all-loving God burn everyone forever? So this is tricky. It doesn't matter how evil you are. Do you deserve eternal punishment? So let's think of the most evil person we know. So Adolf Hitler, pretty bad person, but his sins, as bad as they were limited. He wasn't infinitely evil. You might argue that he was, but does anyone, including Adolf Hitler, deserve infinite punishment? You might say yes. This is a tricky question. So David Hume. David Hume is a philosopher writing in the 1700s, so only 400 years ago. And David Hume was a skeptic, and he was probably an atheist. A skeptic is somebody who questions things and isn't certain about things. An atheist, someone who doesn't believe God. He probably was an atheist, but at the time he was writing, it was very dangerous to say that he was. So he calls hell into question because he asks, what kind of God would do this? Is it just? Is it fair? And this is similar to our Hitler point that we just made. How can a finite, a limited sin warrant an infinite, an infinite punishment? So do you agree with this criticism? So we might argue, well, is hell eternal? You might think that hell maybe is just being wiped out. It's just not existing anymore. And maybe that's nicer. So can God be all-loving if an eternal hell exists? We have another philosopher here, John Hick, who was a Christian. We'll be looking at him more in the course. And he says that an infinite hell is incompatible with a loving God. So John Hick believes that no one goes to hell. Everyone eventually is able to reach heaven, but it just takes longer for some people, and some people have to go through more pain before they get there. Okay, and again, do you agree with this criticism? So we have another idea here, which is election, and this is an important word for Christians. Election means being chosen, so just like a national or a general election. So this is the idea that God has chosen people to go to heaven or hell. Some people are chosen, and we have different kinds of election. We have limited election. And this is the idea that only some people will be saved. And there are loads of problems with this. So one of our philosophers who we'll be looking at in more detail in the weeks to come is called Augustine. And Augustine says that only some people will be saved. And that's because humans are sinful. Original sin means that only some of us will receive salvation as a gift of God's grace. And this is a problem because obviously, why would God create people knowing that some of them have to go to hell? They've got no choice. We've got a big problem there. Augustine uses the example of Adam and Eve. Then we have unlimited election. This is the opposite. This is the idea that everyone will be saved. And this is a view which is promoted by John Hick. We've looked at this already, but also Karl Barth, who is a modern theologian, who says that everyone will be saved, but only if they believe in Jesus Christ. And then we have John Hick, as we've said already, who says that everyone will be saved, even non-Christians. Problem with this is we could ask, why bother being a Christian? What's the point in being a Christian if you can be saved and go to heaven if you're not a Christian? What's the point in being good if you can be saved and go to heaven if you're not good? So it gets tricky. Okay, so limited election and unlimited election. We have issues with limited, we have issues with unlimited. This is where you need to be discussing and coming to your own opinion in essays. My next question is, are heaven and hell actual places? Do they actually exist? Are they physical or are they just metaphorical? So metaphorical means maybe they're just descriptions of a state of mind. So maybe heaven and hell are just ways of thinking, and they're not actually places that exist. So there are lots of arguments for this. You could argue no, because they're described in the Bible as physical places. You could argue no, because Jesus Christ is supposed to be judging the living and the dead. You could argue yes, because we've explored the universe and we don't seem to have discovered a place called heaven or a place called hell. And in fact, the images for heaven and hell are just based on clouds and volcanoes. So next we can talk about Judgment Day. This is a period at the end of time where Jesus is supposed to come back, bring all of the living and the dead before him and divide them. And we should know this from our GCSE, the parable of the sheep and the goats. So I'm not going to read through this, but this is something that you do need to know for the course. So this is Matthew 25. And the idea here is that Jesus brings everyone back and then divides the good, who are the sheep, and the bad, who are the goats. And the second half of this is interesting because it seems that the way that you become a sheep is by helping others. Okay, we have a YouTube video at the bottom there which you can watch if you wish to. Okay, so a possible question in the exam could be critically discuss Jesus' teachings in the parable of the sheep and the goats. So for a question like this, you could begin by just describing, first of all, Matthew 25, and then analysing it. How can we analyse this? Well, we can ask the following questions. What do you have to do to become a sheep? Is it faith or is it good action? Well, it seems to be that it's good action. And then we could ask, well, do you have to be a Christian to be good? There are lots of Muslims and Hindus and Jews and atheists who are good as well. So we might say, well, the only way to be a sheep then is to follow Jesus Christ, because sheep follow and goats don't. Goats run away. But again, we could ask, what does it mean to follow Jesus Christ? Do you have to follow his actions? If you follow his actions, then presumably you could be a Muslim and follow Jesus. Muslims follow Jesus. And also, Jesus just teaches to be good, and you can be good in other religions. So there's so many different ways of answering this question. You could also bring in omnibenevolence as well. Is it loving for Jesus to divide people like this? Okay, I thought Jesus said forgive 77 times, so surely the goats should be forgiven. So there's so many different ways of analysing this. Okay, so how do teachings about the afterlife affect a Christian's moral behaviour? Well, this is quite obvious. You could argue that it makes them become a good person. The philosophical question then is, are Christians really good? Because their motive for being good is maybe fear. So do we even agree that the Christian moral system is a good one? Here's another possible question. Does judgment happen individually, straight after death, or altogether at the end of time? For all of these questions, the best thing to do is to refer to the individual quotes from the Bible and also Christian teachings. So we'll be looking at this in other lessons, but there is another passage from the Apostles' Creed that says that Jesus Christ descended to hell and rescued the Old Testament prophets and all of the good people who were in hell. So we can see this in the bottom right-hand corner. This is called the harrowing of hell. So the idea is that Moses and Abraham and all of the good prophets were in hell. And the reason they were in hell is not because they were bad people, but because they didn't believe in Jesus. And it wasn't their fault they didn't believe in Jesus. They existed before Jesus forgave the original sin. So the idea here is that Jesus rescues them during his resurrection and brings them up to heaven. And that suggests that people are judged straight away after death, because we have people already in hell, not at the end of time. There are lots and lots of different passages to refer to here. So when does judgment, I should say, happen? Straight away after death, the end of time. These are things that you can be discussing and filling in. And finally, we have purgatory. So we have some videos here that you can watch in your own time. Purgatory comes from the word to purge. And to purge means to get rid of. And more precisely, it means to get rid of through pain. Through pain. So purgatory is a place that Catholics traditionally used to believe in, where you're not quite good enough for heaven, but you're not quite bad enough for hell, and your sins are washed away from you. Purgatory is a painful place, a bit like hell, but it doesn't last forever, and you will eventually go to heaven. So the soul is cleansed in order to be able to go to heaven. However, there is also a temporary punishment as a result of being sinful. Catholics believe that they can start this cleansing process in this life. Many Catholics don't believe in it anymore. Okay? This is Carl Rayner here, and he says maybe actually purgatory is on this earth, and it's just a state of mind that you go through, and it's not a real place. Okay? The Catholic Church actually used to use purgatory as a way of raising money, because what they would do is they would sell what's called indulgences. And indulgences were just pieces of paper, and they were pieces of paper, and on them were written, you have now got 5 years out of purgatory. The idea was that if you were sinful, you could pay money to the church, and then you would have time off purgatory. And the Catholic Church used this to raise lots of money, including money to build St. Peter's Basilica, the famous church in Rome. And this is one of the things that actually began the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Church rejected this idea of purgatory. A man called Martin Luther, which we'll learn more about later in the course. So Protestants comes from the word protest, and they protested against this idea of the Catholic Church being able to sell time off in purgatory. They rejected it because it wasn't in the Bible. Protestants refer very closely to the Bible, whereas Catholics refer to the Bible, but also to the teachings of the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church. So this is Matthew. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather scatters. Anyone who speaks against the Son of Man will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come. This is the words of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. And what this seems to suggest is that the only way to get to heaven, or if you're a Catholic, the only way to pass through purgatory, is to be with Jesus Christ. This suggests that faith is the most important thing. And faith matters more than giving money. Okay, so another question you could get asked is purgatory a state through which everyone goes? You can talk about Catholics and Protestants. You can also talk about the fact that good people presumably don't go to purgatory. But then you could argue everyone is bad to a certain extent because they have original sin, but then Jesus Christ forgave people of original sin. So there's lots of different views. Okay, so we've almost finished the lesson. I'm just going to finish off by walking you through two essays. So you'll be writing an essay next week based on the content that we've learned in class. It won't be any of these two essays, just so that you don't have the temptation to copy. So we'll talk a little bit more in class about how to write a really decent essay. The AS level essays are out of 30. So you'll have two essays to answer in an hour and 15 minutes. And they're out of 30. And you get 14 marks for your knowledge, and you get 16 marks. No, sorry, you get 15 marks, apologies, for your knowledge, and you get 15 marks for your analysis. Okay? So I'm going to walk you through a good essay now. We'll talk more about this later. So this essay question says, are heaven and hell eternal? So every time you see red, that's where we're doing analysis. And every time you see black, that is where we're doing knowledge. Obviously, in the exam, it will all be in the same color. Okay. So first paragraph. The concept of heaven and hell plays a huge part in Christianity. Whilst the Old Testament talks little about life after death, the New Testament has a strong focus on where people will end up after they pass away. While some people may disagree and suggest that heaven and hell aren't eternal due to God's omnibenevolent nature, others may disagree. This is due to the New Testament constantly suggesting that the afterlife will last forever. So I've begun this with just a quick sort of intro to some of the ideas. You don't need to do this. Then I've introduced my argument, and this is so important. You need to come down on one side of the argument, and you need to state that at the beginning of the essay. This is very different from your GCSE structure. So this is what I've said. Overall, this essay is going to demonstrate that, although heaven may be eternal, hell isn't, because God is all-loving and merciful. I simply can't believe that an all-loving God would be prepared to punish someone forever. This would make God evil, and I don't believe that he is. Okay, so that's my introduction. So my next paragraph, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kingdom of heaven, whether it's everlasting, and what we think about this. So historically, the Old Testament Jewish tradition didn't tend to focus on the afterlife as much as Christianity would later do. Persecution the ancient Jews went through in history drove them to view their promised land as a form of heaven on earth. The idea of a promised land after death, of an eternal afterlife, gains much greater emphasis with the emergence of Christianity. Many Christians attribute this to the fact that Jesus was executed before he was able to deliver the kingdom of God on earth, so I'm using a quote there. Christians now see this as a reference to a future state of perfection after death. Therefore, in my view, the cornerstone of the faith became the belief in the resurrection and the, quote, life everlasting, which Christ promises. The Apostles' Creed thus refers to the life everlasting as a basic foundation stone of the faith. This suggests that the afterlife is eternal. So I'm actually disagreeing with my opinion here, but that's okay because we're showing both sides of the argument. And what I'm saying is that heaven is eternal. Okay, and any of these ideas, if we haven't gone over them in the PowerPoint, they'll be in your revision guides. Aquinas develops this idea of heaven being eternal with what he calls the beatific vision. This is the belief that the concept of heaven is timeless and unbounded by past, present, or future, but is all free at the same time. This seems similar to the view of an atemporal, four-dimensional God put forward by Boethius and Anselm. God is outside of space and time, therefore to be in the presence of God is to not be in time. Now, I haven't taught you about this, but that's okay. The best A-level essays are essays that bring in things that you've learned outside of the course. And this content is actually from the A2 course, but it's also in your revision guide, so I can give you this information as well. This is the kind of thing that will stretch your answer so that it gets to the top and the highest possible marks. So again, my opinion, I therefore strongly agree that heaven must be eternal, because time would no longer exist in the presence of a timeless God. The Bible appears to support my view because Jesus is said to be seated at the right hand of the Father. If we are to be with Jesus, then this must be an arrangement which is outside of time. Okay, for Christian believers, Jesus' sacrificial atoning death allowed humans to return to the original loving and close relationship with God. This was lost in Eden with the fall from grace. Jesus was able to redeem mankind from Adam and Eve's original sin through his sacrifice on the cross, thus allowing mankind and God's relationship to return to its prior state in paradise. Adam and Eve were immortal and there was no death in the garden, so perhaps a return to the garden would be accompanied by immortality, and therefore I think heaven is eternal. Okay. Next, furthermore, throughout the New Testament, there seem to be suggestions that hell is also eternal. The book of Romans states that, for the wages of sin is death. A literal reading of the Bible may suggest that this means hell isn't a place of eternal damnation, but rather is simply not being resurrected, and instead simply sinners are wiped out of existence. This makes sense as God is all good, and therefore being in his presence would be heaven. An evil place, hell, would therefore have to be in existence away from God and not resurrected by him at all, but instead vanishing into nothingness and ceasing to exist. Therefore, perhaps hell is not eternal. However, contrary to this, a more traditional sense of hell appears in the book of Revelation, which says, "Those not found in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire." This image of hell as a burning lake of fire suggests eternity, as there is no mention of escape. Perhaps purgatory suggests that hell is not eternal, because rather than going there, sinners are purged of their sins and then after a fixed time are given permission to enter heaven. This would suggest hell either doesn't exist or purgatory is simply hell but is not everlasting. Either way, the problem with this view is that the belief in purgatory has been less popular within the Catholic Church in recent years, so may not be a reliable source of evidence for the belief in heaven and hell. There's quite a complicated paragraph there. It could probably do with being split up, but we've got three different views that go back and forth across the argument. Contrastingly, others may argue that the belief in eternal damnation makes us doubt God's omnibenevolence. Hume argues that a God who allows eternal punishment cannot be omnibenevolent at the same time. And I'm making a link here. This is similar to J.L. Mackey's inconsistent triad. So that's a link to something in the philosophy of religion unit, which you'll have learnt by the time you do the exam. How can an all-loving God tolerate the existence of something as evil as hell? I strongly agree with this view and think that it is an escapable, a priori contradiction for omnibenevolence and hell to exist at the same time. So again, this is something else you'll learn throughout the course. The view that perhaps there is no forever in hell and individuals don't remain there for eternity is supported by the Catholic belief in Jesus' descent and rescue of Old Testament prophets, known as the harrowing of hell. Those rescued from hell were moral people that died with original sin as they lived before Christ. Therefore, perhaps hell is not eternal. However, this also suggests that hell may be eternal, because presumably there were those who were not rescued from hell. Hell must therefore be eternal for them. However, Christianity relies heavily on the idea of forgiveness, so perhaps there is still room for all sinners to be rescued eventually, and therefore hell is not eternal. So as you can see, I'm constantly linking back to the question, but I'm also exploring both sides of the argument constantly. And a short conclusion, which is the same as my opening point. To conclude, I have argued that heaven must be eternal, as Aquinas suggests that God's timelessness will mean closeness to God is no longer within time and is therefore eternal. However, I also believe that hell is not eternal. This is because sending sinners to hell for eternity could never be the action of an omnibenevolent God. So this would get full marks. Lots of quotes, lots of good knowledge, and lots of analysis and a clear point of view. Okay? I'm not going to read through the next one. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go through it paragraph by paragraph, and then you can pause the presentation and read it through in your own time. So this is the next question. Can the belief in purgatory ever be justified? Okay, so this is my opening paragraph. Then my next paragraph, analysis at the end, as you can see. And then my next paragraph with analysis at the end. So if you want to read through this, just pause the video now. Okay, and then we have the next paragraph here, lots of analysis, and then the overall conclusion. And again, if you want to pause this and read through it, then please do it now. Okay, that concludes our first week's learning, development in Christian thoughts, life after death.